thank you all so much. I'm excited to go after Heinz Dieter because I think this actually will play very well from his really fascinating work. So today I'm presenting on policy patrons, philanthropic foundations as policy entrepreneurs in US public education. I'm going to be talking about two different research projects, one from my first book and the second from the book that I'm currently slogging through. So looking forward to feedback on that as well. So to begin, ripped from the headlines, as I am wont to do, states embrace core standards for the schools. The New York Times, the LA Unified School District adopts value-added approach to teacher ratings. Los Angeles, big paydays in DC schools, merit system. Should the school day be longer? Personalized learning increases use of computers in class. What do these seemingly disparate headlines have in common? Every one of them is a privately financed, privately championed initiative led by a philanthropic foundation. So, core standards, a major project of the Gates Foundation. Value added, a major project of both Gates and the Broad Foundation. DC merit system, differential compensation, pay for performance, the Broad Foundation. School day be longer, extended school day and year, Ford Foundation, and personalized learning, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So, major policy innovations in how core elements of education policy are delivered. Instruction, who's teaching and how they're evaluated, how they're compensated, the very structure of the school day delivery system. Sorry, I didn't take these off. And how instruction is delivered in the classroom. And a lot of this, you don't know that the foundations are behind, right? A lot of this happens behind the scenes. So today I'm going to kind of go into the belly of the beast, so to speak. Tobias said there's not a lot of work in this, so I'm going to present a little bit of that. So, as Tobias mentioned, education is one of the most frequent areas to which philanthropists like to donate. Interestingly, in the United States, also playing off what you just said, public education is offered in a variety of different ways and institutional forms, but it remains a democratically governed state function. Right? Schools are accountable to education codes that are set by the state. School boards are elected by the public. So, this is really interesting because this sector is so strongly impacted by private involvement. Historically, public education has been a favorite place for philanthropists to donate, and this has really been amplified in about the last 2 decades, as I'll show in a minute. This is often, or I wouldn't say often, this is very attributable to the growth of mega foundations. And in the literature, a mega foundation is often referred to, and this is, again, slippery, but foundations in excess of $100 billion in their endowments. No, not 100 billion, 1 billion in endowments, okay? So very large foundations. And importantly, private philanthropic foundations in the US have some pretty specific legal restrictions on what they can and cannot do with regard to policy. In 1969, there were some watershed regulations passed that limited foundations from being, quote unquote, direct agents of influence on legislation. So that means they can't lobby, they can't engage in electioneering, they can't endorse candidates. But it is also a sufficiently ambiguous law as to allow still a wide scope of latitude for what a foundation can do. So it can educate the public. It can build awareness. All of these terms, I see you laughing, that, could be lobbying by any other name. So foundations actually have a lot of space in which they can act to promote certain policies or preferred models of social order, if you will, even though they're not supposed to. And again, this is why it happens behind the scenes, because they're not allowed to be overt about their policy engagement or their political influence. Okay. So this has also had the effect the legal restrictions of limiting scholarship on foundations' political influence and activity. Because if you're not supposed to, they're not exactly going to let people into their archives, especially in contemporary foundations, or speak on the record about their philosophies or theories of action about influencing policy. So this has started to change again recently in the last couple of decades. But there has been sort of a self-imposed chilling effect of foundations wanting to protect their reputations. So just a brief conceptual framework for what I'm talking about here. Foundations as policy entrepreneurs. And policy entrepreneur is a concept that has come into vogue again in political science. Again, maybe reflecting market forces and entrepreneurship and change agents as the heroes. Policy entrepreneurs are essentially agentic actors who work to promote a certain idea or policy that reflects their own interests. Okay. So on one side of the coin is that foundations are desirable policy entrepreneurs because due to their lack of accountability, they can achieve more effective outcomes. And on the other side is this idea that foundations actually challenge the integrity of the democratic process because they're not accountable. So it's two sides of the same coin. On the one side, foundations can be more agile problem solvers. Paul Ylvasaker, who was one of the more famous foundation presidents in American history in the 50s at the Ford Foundation, says, foundations are America's passing gear. Again, they allow you to circumvent state bureaucracy, experiment, innovate, all of those things. And they can canalize this innovation towards better policy, which again is enabled by their relative lack of accountability. On the other side is that foundations privilege elite views. They amplify the voice of the wealthy without sufficient input from citizens. Again, a foundation cannot be voted out of office, right? There's no real necessary formal feedback mechanisms for foundations to give their views back to foundations that are active in their communities. And again, so this lack of accountability allows them to circumvent processes of democratic deliberation. So this is sort of the more normative model that I am interested in and that has influenced a lot of my work. So within this tension or this spectrum of views, what really is the proper role for foundations to play in a liberal democracy? So this is not going to be a normative presentation about those issues, but tying back to the need for more moral philosophy, if you will. I just wanted to underscore that before I move to the more empirical stuff. So, my first project, how and why do large philanthropic foundations, mega foundations, seek to influence K-12 public education policy in the US? And by policy, I want to just clarify, I'm not just talking about legislation, formal legislation. I'm talking about the wide variety of mechanisms of influence that foundations might engage to have some effect on policy. So, in the last 2 to 3 decades, foundations have really shifted toward more emphasis on policy and advocacy related funding. Tobias described the sort of old model of we're going to fund knowledge production and we're going to hope that it kind of gets into policy. This is a shift from that, what Clemens calls an expert-led model of change. This is more, let's get it directly in with the state. Let's have a more, again, hyper-agency look at what we're doing. So here's a few just data points. So education funders with assets of greater than $100 million, you see that this has increased quite a bit. And again, that's also driven by large foundations like Gates. Giving by these funders. In 2000, very small amount policy related. 2010 going up, by 2015, quite a bit. And we're still tracking this in real time. But all the indications that we're seeing are that, especially for mega foundations, policy and advocacy related work is taking up greater and greater percentages of budgets. So for example, at the Broad Foundation, something like 60% of their budget goes towards policy related activities. Before, it was not that high, and that's really gone up in recent years. So for this project, which is a qualitative inductive project, I looked at 4 of the top 20 largest foundations in the US that are active in funding policy-oriented initiatives. Okay. So these are the 4 foundations I looked at. The Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Okay, and you see there's a wide variety of difference in terms of the size of endowment. They're all over $1 billion, but obviously Gates dwarfs the rest. They have a variety of different founding locations, and they are grouped into kind of 2 categories with regard to when they were founded. And so this is important as well because they reflect kind of 2 different philosophies, cultural norms in their founding environments. Okay, so in the late 1990s, Gates and Broad, Bill Gates, obviously the chairman of Microsoft, a tech icon. Broad, Eli Broad, is also a major US capitalist. He's the only person to ever have founded 2 Fortune 500 companies. And he's very much a venture capital, that kind of a mindset. So these 2 foundations were founded in and imprinted with the norms of the high-tech boom. Whereas Kellogg and Ford are both founded in the 30s, which is an era of very progressive thinking around education. Think about John Dewey and the importance of democracy in education. And so, as I'll talk about, those norms are very much reflected in their ongoing giving habits and processes. So I did 60 interviews with people from these foundations in roughly structurally equivalent roles, so very high level people in the foundations ranging from presidents to senior program officers, legal counsel, board members. And I also talked to a number of national leaders and nonprofits and thought leaders who were active in this space. I also did an extensive archival analysis, analyzing speeches, annual reports, and these sorts of things. And I did an 18-month period of participant observation in another foundation in the top 10 largest foundations. It's not included in the study for reasons I can talk about later, but I was also embedded in this foundation. So like I mentioned, we see really contrasting norms and values among these foundations. So for Gates and Broad, they tend to be very technocratic, very market-oriented, entrepreneurial in their logics of action, right? It's an engineering mindset. It's solution-driven. It's how much can we marshal resources towards a specific technical solution, and how can we do it fast and at scale. They also have living benefactors, which is really important. They're around. They're actively involved in the strategy at these foundations. Whereas Kellogg and Ford, again, going back to what I spoke about Dewey, are very much about social justice and civic engagement and how they organize their grant making. And clearly they don't have living benefactors. So this wound up having very different implications for each foundation. And they also have very different comfort levels with policy involvement. Gates and Broad are very much more out there. We're going to do this. Whereas Kellogg and Ford kind of get scared about damaging their reputations or crossing legal lines. And they have different conceptions of why they engage in policy-related funding, right? I think of it as the ends versus the means. Gates and Broad view policy work as a means to scale the social innovations that they're interested in to the state for broader impact, looking for a return on investment for their pilot experiments. Whereas Kellogg and Ford view policy involvement as a means in and of itself. It goes back to this democratic socialization, the engagement of citizens, that this is a desirable thing for a democratic society. Okay, so from all of these interviews and this process of finding emerging themes, this is what came out of it. And this is a conceptual framework that's intended to provide a basis for comparing different foundations. It's by no means a typology, but I found that the foundations kind of aligned around two different personalities, if you will. One I call outcome-focused, and one I call field-focused. And this quote is something I heard again and again and again in my interviews, that there are basically two kinds of foundations, and that's what I found reflected. Okay, so there's 4 different elements of the typology that show how foundations think differently about how they manage their grantees, who they prefer to work with in terms of organizational partners, how they frame problems and solutions, and how they go about evaluating the results. Okay. So the outcome-focused foundations, which represent Gates and Broad, they have a vision of managing grantees where they have control of an initiative or a process at the foundation level. They are the architects of a strategy. Whereas field-focused foundations tend to start with the grassroots, and control of a policy initiative comes from the bottom up. Okay, so here's some illustrative quotes that show this. Someone from the Gates Foundation talking about managing their grantees. We treat grantees as contractors. Someone from a Ford Foundation in a field-focused capacity. I'm not going to do what 95% of foundations do, which is come up with the answer and sell it. Partners. The outcome-focused foundations prefer to work more with elite and expert practitioners, what people call the grass tops. Whereas the field-focused foundations predominantly prefer to work with community-based organizations at the grassroots. Okay, so again, someone talking about the Gates Foundation, the first order of business is leveraging at the highest level the people who had the most influence. Whereas contrasting in field-focused foundation, if there's a policy direction that grows out of our work, it's come all the way through the bottom and up to the top. Framing problems. The outcome-focused foundations prefer to attack problems that are what we call technical in nature. They are amenable to technical solutions. There's a clear line of causality between X and Y. We know that if we deliver vaccines for malaria, that will eradicate the disease, okay? Versus an adaptive solution, which is messier, more complex, multifaceted, not able to isolate one causal reason for a problem to exist. So, Gates Foundation person, we're technocrats. We wish there was an app for that being poverty. Integrated results, adaptive foundation, Kellogg Foundation, it's about building a field as opposed to injecting a specific idea or a specific technical solution. It's what some people say is old school. And then finally, results. Outcome foundations, focused foundations are predominantly comfortable with results that can be quantifiable, that can provide calculable measures of impact, preferably that is attributable to the foundation itself, whereas integrative results are foundations that use both qualitative and quantitative data and metrics to establish a plausible and defensible case that impact occurred as opposed to one of proof. Okay? So an outcome-focused foundation, to give money to a school, we need to see the test scores rise at least 5% after 1 year. That's the Broad Foundation. Gates Foundation, our outcomes are to get public policies changed. In contrast, from Kellogg, rather than just say the victory was the policy, we need a more complete picture of all the things that need to work to effectuate the outcome you're looking for. Okay, so very different ways of going about their work. Now, as you might imagine, the outcome-focused foundations have become quite powerful. Many say that that's the dominant way of going about philanthropic work in the United States. And there's implications of that, right? In terms of whose voice gets on the agenda and is really central in setting the agenda. So this is someone from Gates talking about their closeness with the Obama administration and the Department of Education. Again, an elite, expert-led strategy. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's this twinkle in the eye when the policy framework came out, and they said, aren't we lucky that the Obama administration's agenda is so compatible with ours? Then there came the twinkle. They wouldn't say it out loud, but you know, the twinkle, right? So there's this implicit acknowledgement. It's very self-reflective on the part of this person that, wow, we know that we caused a lot of this to be in the education policy framework, but we're not going to say it out loud, right? Another person from Gates. We have this enormous power to sway the public conversation and mobilizing lots of resources without robust debate. It's striking to me. And so this is a really interesting debate in terms of the most efficient and effective ways to go about policy change from foundations, right? So we found that close alignment between the government and foundations around policy does lead to impact, at least in the short term, okay? So this is from the Broad annual report, right after Obama came on. The stars have finally aligned. We're poised to cultivate and bring to fruition the seed we and other reformers have planted. Someone from Ford describing what the outcome-focused foundations had invested in. A national curriculum was the third rail. We can't touch that in American politics, but now we have a common core, standards that are shared amongst all the states, and we're moving to a common protocol for teacher evaluations. And then someone at a national nonprofit. I'm amazed at what they've done. Look at how education is a high priority in this country. That's singularly because of Gates and Broad. So they achieved a lot in a very short period of time. But what we are finding is that they may have won the sprint, but they have basically lost the marathon. So in 2016, you start seeing a significant backlash to many of the reforms, the top-down reforms that these foundations had advocated for and that the federal government had taken on. It's the passage of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And this is essentially a referendum on all the policies that Gates and Broad had advocated for a decade. So taking control away from the federal government, devolving it back to states. And this was a result of a significant backlash politically from parents and teachers who didn't like the Common Core standards, who didn't want high stakes testing, who didn't want teacher evaluation. And it felt like it had been imposed upon them from the federal government. And so this resulted in a lot of states that had originally passed Common Core legislation backing out from it and saying, actually, no, this is not working for us. And you start to see the Gates Foundation in particular being kind of humbled by this. And here's the CEO talking about, we missed an opportunity to engage educators, teachers, parents, and communities. It's a challenging lesson for us to absorb. You start seeing Melinda and Bill talking more about community buy-in and the need to engage in democratic politics as opposed to circumventing them and going full speed ahead, which is more resonant with, again, a technical managerial approach. You have to go more slowly. Gates is moving away from a top-down managerial approach. And just last October, they announced that they were no longer pursuing their top-down reforms. They were going to invest in locally governed school networks and becoming a catalyst of good ideas, as opposed to an architect of those ideas. So this is a major, major shift for an outcome-focused foundation to do. Okay, and it reflects the fact that a political backlash occurred in response to a very technocratic reform. I'm doing. So that brings me to my current project. So we have found that philanthropic foundations have a lot of power to sway the national conversation, that they do engage in this hyper agency in terms of formulating, endorsing, diffusing ideas that reflect their own institutional values, whether that's technical and managerial or more social justice oriented. And so I just wanted to zero in really quick on the knowledge production capacity of foundations, right? And so traditionally we have seen, historically, foundations commission, they sponsor research, they spread it out into the policy community. They also serve a role as an ideational broker. They elevate and they adjudicate between different types of ideas, and they anoint certain ideas and policy innovations as better than others. And so this has changed a lot over time, and if you'll indulge me, I have a very professional illustration of this. So in the traditional, you can't really see this, but the traditional conception of foundation sponsoring of knowledge and research, the foundation gives money to the university makes stuff, they hope that somehow it gets to policymakers through very nonlinear lines, and then advocates are over here advocating for policymakers, but there's not a close coupling between researchers and advocates. Whereas now, what we're seeing is that multiple foundations align their policy priorities, and you can't see this again because I didn't animate it correctly, but they're giving money not to universities, but to think tanks and nonprofit organizations, who are often one and the same as advocacy organizations, and come up with ideas and research reports that are then directly injected to the policy discourse. So again, this is another example of hyperagency. Foundations are taking control of the knowledge and the message they want to put out in the world. They're making sure that that is reflected in the research that's done, and then instead of just letting things happen, they're making sure it gets directly onto the political agenda. And so I just want to briefly talk about teacher evaluation as a case for how this is happening. So between 2001 and again the passage of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2016, it's a huge accountability movement in American education. This narrative that US schools are failing, and that a large part of this is that teachers are bad. Teachers are not equipping our students with what they need to learn. And so this has resulted in a number of federal mandates that are for more stringent oversight of school performance. And so what that has meant is that schools can be taken over by the state if they're not meeting adequate yearly progress in their students' test scores. If they're not getting over a certain benchmark, they can lose their independence. And so there's been a number of attempts historically to evaluate teachers and to differentiate them between them, but this was seen as the real central lever of the accountability movement, that you have to be able to see which teachers are good and which are bad in order to have any impact on the broader system. And so this law was passed in 2001 that mandated these greater accountability measures, greater testing of students, provided a lot of disaggregated data on student performance that was never available before. And it allowed researchers to link student test scores to their teachers and to provide measures of teachers' value added. So essentially, a student is tested at the beginning of a year, that's the baseline, and then at the end of the year. And the percentage growth between, or decline between start and end, is the teacher's value added, what that teacher individually has brought to the student in their learning. And this is a quantitative estimate. And there's a lot of debate in the education research community. These metrics work really well to identify the highest performing teachers and the lowest performing, but not so great in the middle. It can be very spurious as to how much of this growth is actually due to the teacher themselves, right? But this quickly became part and parcel of all the major federal reforms that happened, there was a rapid convergence around value added as a resonant solution, crowded out a lot of other approaches in this field of teacher evaluation. So why did this happen? Okay. Well, we see that it became very central, became all you heard about, everyone talked about, it was going to be the panacea. It has a common sense of appeal, and that's of course to an MBA, something a technocrat could love. Recalling some of the Outcome-Focused Foundation's core strategies, right? Here's another great quote from someone at the Gates Foundation. All those caveats about the effectiveness of the methodology, people get away from the technical appendices, they distill them into PowerPoint, and then into data to inform decisions. All that gets washed away, and it comes back to the presupposition you began with, which is value added is the way to evaluate and pay teachers. So this convoluted quote is referring to this process of foundations producing evidence that supports a pre-existing opinion. Otherwise known as advocacy research, or what we call policy-based evidence making. In American policy, everything must be evidence-based. But what you see, especially in these outcome-focused foundations, is that there is a given policy that is resonant with a particular mindset, perhaps a managerial, technocratic one. You go out and you find evidence to support that, which is why you might find it in a think tank or a nonprofit as opposed to a rigorous research university, right? So lots of advocacy research. And we find in our book, in our study, that 90% of the research that is cited in congressional testimony on teacher evaluation, again, experts who are advocating for certain approaches to the federal government, 90% of the research is advocacy research. It's not peer-reviewed. There's one article from Econometrica that is cited. Everything else is from a think tank or a nonprofit and is non-rigorous. Okay. And so foundations talk about why they do this in ways like the following. We saw a need to be more involved, not just putting ideas out there, but guiding the conversation, more hands-on, right? So from this to this. We fund everyone who does advocacy. They're dominating a field in this way. I'm going to skip over that. And so this has significant implications for policy and practice, right? Again, the preferences of elite funding are what gets on the agenda and what determines priorities. The research that is produced has widespread diffusion, and this is due to something called selective attention processing. I think, Tobias, you said, if you give someone an academic paper, it's going straight into the bin. This is why. No one's going to read Econometrica. They're going to read a nice, flashy report from the New Teacher Project that talks about, here are the 3 ways in which it's more effective to do a certain policy, right? You don't want a lot of nuance. You want some concrete recommendations that will help you make decisions. So foundations have tapped into this. A lot of times people don't know what is empirically rigorous. If you see a study, you're not going to look through the methods section and talk about validity if you're a policymaker, right? But then this had significant implications, this widespread diffusion of the advocacy research and the way in which it really elevated value added above other types of solutions. What happened is that people took value added methodologies, used them to calculate teacher value added, and then made hiring and firing decisions based on this knowledge. So here's a very respected academic talking about we're going to use the value-added data to identify the bottom 8% of teachers, and we'll fire them, and that's going to create all this value. So that became the narrative, that this quantitative estimate alone is going to determine your career trajectory. And this resulted in a lot of damage to the teaching profession. This is someone who designed value-added as a strategy at the Gates Foundation. There was collateral damage. There was too much teacher blame. This was a baby that was born under a cloud. And so it was hard to pull the child from under the cloud. And so this resulted, again, in what I talked about earlier in 2016. There's a national backlash against the use of teacher value-added evaluation, and a lot of states stopped using it entirely. But that was a policy that was advanced, endorsed, and really driven by outcome-focused foundations. Okay. So just to end, actually going back to what Adam has been talking about, let's have some lessons learned from both projects. And one is that policies seem to stick better if you slow down and invest for the long term. If you're not focused on finding one thing and then scaling it up very broadly and then perhaps getting rid of it if it fails. Invest for the long term. Invest not in one-off projects, but in organizations themselves that you believe in. Build in meaningful mechanisms through which communities that are affected by the philanthropic work can give feedback to the foundations that are active in their communities and hold them accountable. Seek out discrepant views. Because again, foundations exist in a vacuum, and they don't have to listen to discrepant views if they don't want to, but it's become increasingly important. And then structurally include the grassroots in any strategy that you engage with. Like deliberately attend to the political processes. And here are two quotes, first from a Gates Foundation person and second from a national nonprofit leader. How do you establish a bottom-up versus top-down mix? It's a puzzle we've never resolved. At the beginning, we were too top-down, but bottom-up seldom came up with breakthrough thinking. The big think things came from a tight group of people with a blank sheet of paper. So again, that's the expert, elite-driven strategy that is preferential for outcome-focused foundations, whereas this next person says that a bottom-up approach is a more effective way to do policy change in philanthropy. And in the long run, you need to have that democratic element to make it stick. Okay, so this is an ongoing debate. There is a shift in the broader philanthropic field towards becoming more field-focused, having seen the failures of high-profile reforms like value-added, and a need to really engage those who are affected by work in a more democratic deliberative process. So things are changing, but other strategies like the production of advocacy research to justify a preconceived policy preference are also increasing. So those are two different tensions that are currently very much salient within education policy and really interesting to observe in real time as the terrain is changing. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much.